Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to talk about anticoagulant and thrombolytic drugs. Okay, so this video is going to be in the playlist on the cardiovascular system, and it is a continuation of a video that is also in the playlist on the cardiovascular system entitled Hemostasis. Now, in the video entitled Hemostasis, we talk about the hemostatic pathway, we talk about the formation of a platelet plug, and we talk about the intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation cascade which produce a fibrin mesh. We also talk about thrombosis in that video, the formation of pathological blood clots inside perfectly intact blood vessels. That video, the content of that video, is necessary to have watched before you move on to this video, so I highly advise you to have watched the video on hemostasis prior to watching this video on anticoagulant and thrombolytic drugs. Okay, so now let's actually begin. So we're going to talk about anticoagulant and thrombolytic drugs. So firstly, let's just talk about what these two broad categories of drugs are. So anticoagulant drugs, as the name suggests, are drugs that prevent coagulation. You take them and they stop your blood from coagulating. Coagulation means the transformation of the blood from being a liquid to being a solid. Okay, so they are going to be given to people who are at risk of thrombosis, risk of coagulation occurring in the middle of intact blood vessels, okay, which is pathological. So they are preventative drugs to prevent thrombosis. Thrombolytics, meanwhile, are what you would give after thrombosis has already occurred. Okay, so these are preventatives. These are to actually deal with thrombosis once it's occurred. So if someone has just suffered a heart attack or a stroke because they have a thrombus in one of their coronary or brain blood vessels that is now blocking blood flow to a certain area of the myocardium or the brain, then we need to lyse that thrombus to restore blood flow to the area. That's when you would use thrombolytics, to break up a thrombus that has already formed. So here we're going to look at preventatives for thrombosis and things to actually deal with thrombosis once it's actually occurred. Okay, so we're going to begin then with anticoagulants, and then we'll move on to thrombolytics. So the first two anticoagulants that I want to tell you about are anticoagulants that will be given to people who you think are at risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. And the two that we're specifically going to look at are aspirin and clopidogrel. Okay, so firstly let me just talk about who is at risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. So thrombosis, the production of pathological blood clots in the middle of perfectly intact blood vessels. What generally causes that? Well, in the video on hemostasis we talked about the fact that there are two major types of thrombosis: arterial thrombosis, which occurs in arteries, and venous thrombosis, which occurs in veins. For arterial thrombosis, one of the major things that causes it is atherosclerotic plaques. And the reason for that is that atherosclerotic plaques, they are formed because endothelial cells, well, we believe, it's still a little bit uncertain, but we believe atherosclerosis occurs because endothelial cells have been damaged. Okay? And whilst you're having atherosclerosis occurring, those endothelial cells that are over the atherosclerotic plaque, they have very odd behaviour, and they start releasing molecules that they wouldn't usually release that can then activate platelets. And we know that the activation of platelets is the first thing that then triggers the production of the thrombus. Once you've activated the platelets, that will then cause platelet aggregation to form a platelet plug, essentially, in the middle of the blood vessel, and then the activated platelets will then also trigger the intrinsic coagulation cascade to produce a fibrin mesh, so you'll end up with a full-on thrombus in the middle of your blood vessel. Okay, so really this question becomes, who is at risk of atherosclerosis? So what are the risk factors for atherosclerosis? Well, one that is very famous is hypercholesterolemia, having far too high blood cholesterol levels. particularly if it's in the form of LDL in the bloodstream. Okay, so having far too high blood cholesterol levels predisposes you to develop atherosclerotic plaques in your arteries, and if those develop in your coronary arteries, or the arteries that supply your brain, you are then at risk of getting thrombosis on top of those in those arteries, and therefore you're at risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. Other risk factors for atherosclerosis are hypertension, having too high blood pressure. This is believed to damage the walls of the blood vessel and lead to atherosclerosis. Diabetes that is poorly controlled is also a risk for atherosclerosis. If you've got uncontrolled diabetes, then you have far too high blood glucose level, and that's very toxic to the cells of the blood vessel wall as well, and can lead to atherosclerotic plaques occurring. Another important risk factor is cigarette smoke. Okay, so if you smoke, then you will be inhaling the cigarette smoke, and the toxins in cigarette smoke will then be going into your lungs, crossing into your bloodstream, and in your bloodstream will then be doing damage to your blood vessel walls, leading to atherosclerosis. So all of those 4 risk factors, hypercholesterolemia, high blood pressure, diabetes that is poorly controlled, and smoking, they all predispose you to developing atherosclerosis. If you develop that in your coronary circulation or your cerebral circulation, then you are at risk of getting thrombi forming in those blood vessels, and therefore you're at risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. Okay, so in people who we think are at risk of atherosclerosis in their coronary or cerebral circulations, we want to put them on things that are going to prevent thrombosis, anticoagulants, and 2 of the major drugs that are given prophylactically to people at risk of having heart attacks or stroke are aspirin and clopidogrel. And I want to explain how it is that these drugs make it less likely that you will actually get thrombi forming. Okay, so we'll begin with aspirin and then we'll talk about clopidogrel. They actually have very similar mechanisms. Okay, both of these are going to stop the chain reaction of platelet activation. Okay, so remember, in order to get a thrombus being formed, what you have to do is activate a huge number of platelets. Now, some of the platelets will be activated by coming into contact with the molecules that these damaged endothelial cells are releasing. So at the site of atherosclerosis, these damaged endothelial cells are releasing molecules that are then activating platelets. Some of them will be directly activated by that, but not nearly enough to actually form a thrombus. You need to have absolutely loads activated to form a thrombus. Okay, therefore, a really important part of platelet activation is the chain reaction. So remember, when platelets activate, they release lots of molecules to then go off and activate other platelets. Okay, and this causes a chain reaction of platelets activating more platelets, so that you get a huge number of platelets being activated, and all of those activated platelets will now aggregate together and form the platelet plug that will then go on, once it's got a fibrin mesh, to become a thrombus. Okay, so I'm just going to get up the piece of paper from the previous video on hemostasis in which we go over this. Okay, so here is the relevant picture. So here is a platelet that is undergoing activation, and we've talked about the fact that they release all of these substances. So the key chain reaction substances that we saw were thromboxane A2, von Willebrand factor, and ADP. Okay, aspirin is going to work by taking out thromboxane A2, while clopidogrel is going to work by taking out ADP to try and decrease the chain reaction, to try and reduce the number of platelets that are actually going to be activated by this chain reaction, and therefore trying to prevent thrombus formation. Okay, that's the way that these 2 drugs are going to work. They're both going to try to prevent the chain reaction. So aspirin is going to stop platelets from releasing thromboxane A2. They work at slightly different levels. Aspirin actually prevents the platelets releasing thromboxane A2. Clopidogrel is actually going to stop the ADP from working on other platelets. Okay, so although the overall mechanism, i.e. preventing the chain reaction, is the same, their targets are different, and the stage at which they target their individual target is different. Okay, so aspirin is going to stop platelets releasing thromboxane A2. So I want to go into the mechanism a little bit more. So how does aspirin actually stop platelets from releasing thromboxane A2? Well, the aspirin, when you take it, is going to go into the bloodstream, and it's going to go into the platelets, and in the platelets it is going to block the activity of an enzyme that is important in the production of thromboxane A2. So I'm now going to show you a little part of the pathway which produces thromboxane A2. So here is a part of the pathway. So in activated platelets, they start producing thromboxane A2, which goes off and activates more platelets in this chain reaction. Okay, now, in activated platelets, they are going to start converting a molecule called arachidonic acid. Okay, now arachidonic acid is a very long carboxylic acid molecule. It's a 20-carbon long carboxylic acid molecule that will be present in the cell membranes of platelets. Okay, they can break down other lipid molecules, other phospholipid molecules in their cell membranes to release arachidonic acid, okay, and this will be occurring in the activated platelets. So there is a bit that we're missing out here, the bit that comes before where the arachidonic acid comes from. But in activated platelets, you're going to be producing arachidonic acid by breaking down phospholipids to release the arachidonic acid, and now we're going to study what's going to happen to the arachidonic acid to convert it into thromboxane A2. So these activated platelets will take arachidonic acid, and there are a few steps to convert it into thromboxane A2. You firstly convert it into prostaglandin G2, so PG is for prostaglandin, I'll just write its full name out here. So the first P and G is for prostaglandin, and this is specifically prostaglandin G2 here. And then prostaglandin G2 will be converted into prostaglandin H2, and then from prostaglandin H2 you can convert that into thromboxane A2. And aspirin is going to work to block the production of thromboxane A2 by getting rid of these two steps here. It's going to take out the conversion of arachidonic acid to prostaglandin G2, and it's going to take out the conversion of prostaglandin G2 to prostaglandin H2. Okay, so let's just study the enzyme then that catalyzes these two jumps, because it's the same enzyme. Okay, so to summarize, in these platelets you'll be producing arachidonic acid. So in activated platelets, they start producing arachidonic acid, and then they start converting this into thromboxane A2. But to convert it into thromboxane A2, you have to firstly convert it to prostaglandin H2. And to convert it to prostaglandin H2, you go through prostaglandin G2. Now, both of these reactions, the conversion of arachidonic acid to prostaglandin G2 and the conversion of prostaglandin G2 to prostaglandin H2 are catalyzed by the same enzymes. And these enzymes are known as cyclooxygenase enzymes, or COX enzymes. Okay, so cyclo, and I won't bother putting a dash in there, cyclooxygenase enzymes. Okay, right, often just abbreviated down to COX enzymes. So this is the target for aspirin. Aspirin works by inhibiting cyclooxygenase enzymes. So now I will put a little inhibitory arrow here, and this is what aspirin is going to do. So aspirin is going to go inside platelets, and when platelets get activated, they are no longer going to be able to make thromboxane A2, the reason being that aspirin will have inhibited their cyclooxygenase enzymes, which means that when they become activated, they won't be able to convert the arachidonic acid into prostaglandin G2 and then into prostaglandin H2, and if they don't produce that prostaglandin H2, they can't produce the thromboxane A2, okay, the TXA2 over here. Okay, and without the thromboxane A2, then you take out a large part of that chain reaction, and if you don't get enough platelets activated, then you're not going to produce a big enough cluster of activated platelets to actually result in thrombus formation. So that is how aspirin has its anticoagulant effect. Clopidogrel has a very similar mechanism of action, but a different target. Okay, it's also going to work to prevent the chain reaction of platelet activation. So, remember, another one of the molecules involved in the chain reaction, as I showed you earlier, is ADP. This is released in the dense granules of platelets. So when platelets activate, not only do they start producing thromboxane A2, but they also exocytose their dense granules and their alpha granules, as we discussed in the video on hemostasis in detail. And in the dense granules, they're going to release ADP. Okay, so in the dense granules, one of the molecules in there is ADP, and they release that. out into the blood. Okay, and the ADP will then go off and act on other platelets via this P2Y12 receptor. So it goes off and acts on P2Y12 receptors on other platelets and triggers them to activate. So just like thromboxane A2, which it takes part in this chain reaction, ADP also takes part in this chain reaction. Clopidogrel is an antagonist, a competitive antagonist for P2Y12 receptors. It binds to P2Y12 receptors and blocks ADP from being able to bind there. And itself, it does not activate the P2Y12 receptor. So it binds, does not activate, therefore does not cause platelet activation, but just blocks the ADP from being able to bind there, and therefore blocks ADP from being able to bind and activate the P2Y12 receptor. So clopidogrel is an antagonist for the P2Y12 receptor and therefore blocks ADP from being able to participate in the chain reaction. Okay, so to summarise, if you're taking clopidogrel, and both of these medications are taken orally, which is why they can be taken on a regular basis. So PO is the medical way of saying orally. It means per os, for the mouth. Okay, in Latin. So whenever you see PO on a prescription chart, it means orally. So I'll just put this means in Latin per, which means for, and then os, which means mouth. Okay, so both of them are taken orally. When you take clopidogrel, it will go into your bloodstream and it will bind to the P2Y12 receptors on your platelets, and if there should arise a chance where thrombosis might be about to occur, it will stop ADP from being able to participate in the chain reaction, and therefore you might not get enough platelets activated now to actually produce a thrombus. So again, that is how it prevents thrombus formation, by preventing the chain reaction of platelet activation by taking out the ADP component of this chain reaction signalling. Okay, so that is aspirin and clopidogrel then. Okay, and they, as I say, are given prophylactically to people who are at risk of having a heart attack or a stroke. We're now going to go to a very powerful but higher up drug, okay, a more dangerous drug to be taking that is given to people who really are at terrible risk of having thrombus formation inside their blood vessels. And this is warfarin. It's a very powerful drug, a very useful drug, but a scarily dangerous drug as well. Okay, this really does stop your blood from coagulating. It's more powerful than these two. Okay, right, so warfarin, what would you be taking warfarin for? So warfarin is given to people who are at extreme risk of having thrombus formation inside their blood vessels. So for instance, if someone has a prosthetic heart valve, that prosthetic heart valve is at terrible risk of thrombosis occurring over it. Okay, it's at terrible risk of platelets activating over it, and it's at risk of having the intrinsic coagulation cascade activating over it. Okay, so if you've got a prosthetic heart valve, there is a lot of risk that thrombosis is going to occur over that prosthetic heart valve. In people with that risk, that sort of level of risk of thrombosis, in those people you would give warfarin to prevent coagulation from actually occurring. Okay, so let's go over now how warfarin prevents coagulation from occurring. It's an extremely powerful anticoagulant. Okay, so warfarin is described as a vitamin K antagonist. Okay, now this is something that we also discuss in the video on hemostasis. When we're looking at bleeding disorders, we talk about why vitamin K deficiency actually results in problems with the hemostasis process, problems with coagulation. Warfarin is effectively going to induce the same thing as vitamin K deficiency. It's going to produce vitamin K deficiency in the people who take it. Okay, but it's not actually going to get rid of all the vitamin K, but it's going to do effectively the same thing as far as coagulation factors are concerned. So let me just remind you of why vitamin K is so important in coagulation. Okay, so there are certain coagulation factors whose function is reliant on the presence of a modified amino acid. Okay, a modified amino acid by the name of gamma-carboxyglutamate. So coagulation factors number 2, 7, 9, and 10, their function is completely dependent upon them having a modification made whilst they are still in the cells of the liver. Okay, and this modification is that they need certain glutamate residues modifying into gamma carboxyglutamate. So they need to have certain glutamate residues modified into gamma carboxyglutamate residues. Okay, and these gamma carboxyglutamate residues that you will find in coagulation factor 2, 7, 9, and 10 molecules, they are absolutely essential for the function, the correct function of those coagulation factors. So if you do not convert the glutamate residues into gamma carboxyglutamate residues in these coagulation factors, then these coagulation factors will no longer function properly, and therefore you will lose the intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation cascades. You will lose the ability to make a fibrin meshwork, and the fibrin meshwork is absolutely essential to actually produce a strong thrombus. Platelets just aggregating together, that's not very strong. It will disintegrate very, very easily. You have to have the fibrin mesh to have actually a strong thrombus. Okay, so if you can't convert your glutamate residues into gamma carboxyglutamate residues in these coagulation factors, then they're not going to function properly, and you're going to completely stop thrombosis. This is what warfarin is going to prevent. It's going to prevent the liver cells from modifying these coagulation factors so that they have gamma carboxyglutamate residues in when they're producing them. Okay, so you'll end up with coagulation factor 2, 7, 9, and 10 not actually being functional in people taking warfarin, and therefore you won't get coagulation occurring. So very, very powerful anticoagulant. So how does warfarin actually achieve this? Well, it inhibits the enzyme vitamin K oxide reductase. Okay, so let me remind you of what the purpose of vitamin K oxide reductase is. So the enzyme which catalyzes the conversion of glutamate to gamma carboxyglutamate, that is known as gamma glutamyl carboxylase. Okay, and when it's actually catalyzing this conversion, it has to also convert vitamin K in the reduced form to vitamin K in the oxidized form. So every time it converts a glutamate molecule into a gamma carboxyglutamate molecule, it will also convert a reduced vitamin K molecule into an oxidized vitamin K molecule. Okay, so reduced vitamin K is converted into oxidized vitamin K every time you convert a glutamate residue into a gamma carboxyglutamate residue. Okay, so before long you are going to run out of reduced vitamin K, and you're going to end up with loads of oxidized vitamin K. To prevent this from happening, and to mean that we can still continue to make gamma carboxyglutamate residues in our coagulation factors 2, 7, 9, and 10, we have to have an enzyme which converts oxidized vitamin K back into reduced vitamin K, and this is the vitamin K oxide reductase, or the VCOR enzyme. Okay, so VCOR stands for the vitamin K, that's the VK, and then the O is for oxide, and then the R is for reductase. So vitamin K in the oxidized form, and we are going to reduce it back again, so this enzyme is going to be a reductase. Okay, so this is an extremely important enzyme. Okay, right, so to summarize then, for the function of these coagulation factors, for the function of coagulation factor 2, 7, 9, and 10, they need to have some of their glutamate residues converted into gamma carboxyglutamate residues whilst they're still in liver cells before they have been released into the bloodstream. The enzyme that does that conversion is called gamma glutamyl carboxylase, and every time it converts a glutamate residue into a gamma carboxyglutamate residue, it has to also convert a reduced vitamin K molecule into an oxidized vitamin K molecule. To prevent the oxidized vitamin K running out, there is another enzyme called vitamin K oxide reductase, VCOR, which converts oxidized vitamin K back into reduced vitamin K. This is the enzyme now that warfarin inhibits. So if you take warfarin, it will go into your liver cells and it will inhibit the vitamin K oxide reductase enzyme, and therefore prevent the conversion of oxidized vitamin K back into reduced vitamin K. So oxidized vitamin K will build up, gamma-glutamyl carboxylase will not be able to function. You will continue making coagulation factors 2, 7, 9, and 10, but now they won't have these glutamate residues being converted into gamma-carboxyglutamate residues, i.e. they won't anymore be functional. Okay, that completely takes out the intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation cascade. It means that it's no longer possible to actually make fibrin meshes, and therefore thrombosis becomes extremely difficult. Okay, and it's a very, very powerful anticoagulant. Therefore, the problem, of course, is that if you cut yourself whilst on this drug, hemostasis will not work. You will just bleed and bleed and bleed for a very, very long time before eventually, maybe, you might get a solid enough platelet plug to actually prevent the hemorrhage further. Okay, but it takes a very, very long time to stop bleeding when you're on warfarin. Okay, so it's a very extreme drug to take, but it is very powerful at what it does, and it will prevent thrombosis, even in people at huge risk of thrombosis. Okay, right. The next drug then that I want to talk about is heparin, and also the low molecular weight heparins. Okay, and I'll just mention one of those, but there are quite a few now. Okay, so the next drug that I want to talk about is heparin, another very powerful anticoagulant. Okay, so heparin is very similar to a molecule that we talk about in the video on hemostasis. In the video on hemostasis, when we're talking about the body's natural endogenous ways of preventing thrombosis, we talk about the fact that the liver produces a molecule called antithrombin-3. This goes into the bloodstream and then binds to heparan sulfate molecules on the surface of endothelial cells. Okay, so in the video on hemostasis we talk about heparan sulfate. Heparin is very similar to heparan. It's another big carbohydrate molecule. Okay, now we get heparin, I believe, from beef liver. Okay, so from cows' livers. Okay, and what you can do is you can inject heparin in, or give it by subcutaneous injection. So heparin, the more difficult thing about it is that it has to be given by intravenous injection or subcutaneous injection, whereas all the drugs, including warfarin that we've seen so far, can be given orally. Okay, so heparin has to be given by intravenous injection or by subcutaneous injection. Okay, and it's a huge carbohydrate molecule then that will go into the bloodstream, and what it will do is it will activate antithrombin-3 in exactly the same way as heparan sulfate would on the surface of endothelial cells. So what will now happen is heparin will bind antithrombin-3 molecules that are in the blood. Okay, and if you don't know what these are, you need to watch the video on hemostasis. Okay, so antithrombin-3, AT3, this molecule that's produced in the liver, and once the antithrombin-3 is bound to the heparin, just like what would happen if it binds to the heparan sulfate molecules, it then becomes active and is now capable of inhibiting factor 2A and also factor 10A. So it can inhibit thrombin, and it can also inhibit factor 10A. Now those are incredibly important at the ends of both the intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation cascades. So remember, they are right at the end. Thrombin is the one that actually converts fibrinogen into fibrin monomers so that the fibrin monomers can aggregate into a fibrin polymer, which can then form fibrin meshworks. Factor 10A is the one that forms the prothrombinase complex with factor 5A and calcium on the surface of activated platelets to activate factor 2 prothrombin into thrombin. Okay? Antithrombin-3, once activated, can inactivate both of these. So that if in anywhere in the bloodstream you are getting these activated at a site where potentially thrombosis is about to occur, what can now happen is you can inhibit those before the fibrin meshwork is actually starting to take shape. Okay, and therefore you can prevent the production of fibrin meshworks, you can switch off the intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation cascades, and prevent thrombosis. Okay, so heparin is an extremely powerful drug that can prevent thrombosis from occurring. Okay, what I'd like to add on is a discussion of the low molecular weight heparins, the LMWHs. Okay, so LMWH stands for low molecular weight heparins. So LMW stands for low molecular weight, and then the H stands for heparins. Okay, so the low molecular weight heparins are the smaller versions of heparin. They do the same thing as heparin, but they are much smaller. So heparin is a very large molecule. It's a massive, great carbohydrate molecule that we extract from beef liver. Very similar to heparan sulfate, which is the endogenous carbohydrate molecule that we have on the surface of our endothelial cells, which has the job of activating antithrombin-3 and forms part of the endogenous anticoagulant mechanisms to prevent thrombosis. Okay? It's very, very large. We have modified it, we've chopped it up and taken little fragments of it, and this gives rise to the low molecular weight heparins. And the key one that I'm going to mention here, there are lots of them, but the key one that I'm going to mention is a drug called enoxaparin. Okay, so enoxaparin is a little fragment of heparin, much, much smaller than heparin. Okay, and it does the same thing as heparin, so it will also bind antithrombin-3 molecules, and it will then activate the antithrombin-3 molecules so that they can then inactivate factor 2A and factor 10A. Now, enoxaparin, the reason I mention it is that this is one of the major ones that is given to people when they go into hospital. So in the video on hemostasis, I talk about the fact that when people are admitted to hospital to stay, they're going to be laid in bed a lot, and when you're not moving in bed for a long time, you are at risk of venous thrombosis. You're at risk of blood in the venous circulation becoming static, not moving, and when that occurs, you are at risk of the platelets actually activating. So blood being static is one of the things that can cause platelets to activate and therefore can lead to thrombosis occurring. That's one of the major things that can lead to venous thrombosis, which can be very dangerous as well, just as dangerous as arterial thrombosis, because little bits of the thrombus can end up breaking off and forming thromboemboli, which can then go and lodge in arteries in the heart or in the brain and therefore lead to myocardial infarction and strokes, just the same as arterial thrombosis. Okay, so when people go into hospital, we give them preventative medicines to prevent venous thrombosis from occurring, and one of the major ones that is used is enoxaparin, this low molecular weight heparin, this fragment of the heparin molecule. Okay, and it's usually given by subcutaneous injection. Okay, right, and usually every day that you're in hospital you will get a subcutaneous injection of enoxaparin to prevent venous thrombosis from occurring in your venous circulation. Okay, so the one thing to say is that in people with renal problems, renal insufficiency, then enoxaparin is contraindicated and you'd use the good old heparin. So if you've got a patient with renal failure, then you wouldn't use the low molecular weight heparin. In everyone else, enoxaparin is preferred to heparin, but in people with renal failure, heparin is better tolerated than enoxaparin. Okay, so these two drugs, however, do work in the same way, and they are incredibly good at preventing thrombosis from occurring. And as I say, the major use of these two is given to prevent venous thrombosis in people who are coming into hospital and staying in hospital. Okay, so I think we'll have a break there, and in the next video what we'll do is continue on with the anticoagulants. We've got a few more anticoagulants to discuss, and then we'll move on to the thrombolytics.